Jack had always preferred the quiet life. He worked as a librarian in a small old library in a corner of the city, far from the chaos of the world. While everyone else was caught up in the latest alien invasion reports, Jack found solace between the shelves of books, the only place that felt safe to him. The world outside had become a mess of strange happenings, with alien ships appearing in the sky and cities in ruins. But to Jack, it felt like just another headline, something that didn't touch his life. Until tonight. It was late, past midnight, when Jack was finishing his usual rounds. The library was about to close, and there was nothing unusual about the evening. The streets outside were quiet, the only noise the occasional hum of distant machinery or a low growl of a hovercar passing by. Jack walked through the aisles, making sure everything was in place, his thoughts drifting. That's when he heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper of movement. He froze. The noise was soft but unmistakable. It came from somewhere deep within the library, between the shelves of ancient books where no one should be. Jack's heartbeat quickened, but he told himself it was probably just an animal or a trick of the wind. He moved cautiously, the creak of his shoes the only sound in the silence. As he rounded a corner near the back of the library, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, lying on the floor in the shadows, was a figure, an alien woman. At first glance, she looked like something out of a nightmare. Her skin shimmered with an odd, iridescent glow, casting strange reflections in the dim light. Her clothes were torn, as if she had been through some kind of violent struggle. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, and her body was covered with strange markings, as if she were branded by her own kind. Jack stood there, staring at her, frozen. How did she get here? The alien invasion was a constant fear on the news, but he had never expected it to come to his door. But this wasn't some invader. She was different, wounded, and she looked scared. Jack's first instinct was to run, to call the authorities, but as he stared at her, something held him back, something human in her eyes. He cautiously approached her, crouching down to check for signs of life. She was breathing, shallow but steady. Before he could think about what to do next, a loud clang echoed from the far side of the library. Jack's head snapped up. The unmistakable sound of robotic footsteps grew closer, growing louder with every second. His heart raced. He knew what that sound meant. Alien soldiers. They were after her. The cold fear gripped his chest. His hand trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. Should he call for help? The authorities had been unable to stop the alien forces. Everyone was on edge, and calling them might only lead to more chaos. He needed to think fast. Jack's mind raced, considering his options. He couldn't just leave her here, not like this. She might not survive, and if the soldiers found her, they would certainly kill her or worse. The strange markings on her skin were a clue. She wasn't a regular alien invader. She looked like she was from a faction or group on the run. Suddenly, the door to the library banged open, and the soldiers stepped in. Tall, armored, their robotic voices scanning the surroundings. The quiet of the library shattered, replaced by cold, metallic voices. Target acquired. Search Sector 3, one of the soldiers called out, his voice robotic and emotionless. Jack's heart pounded. The soldiers were closing in. His eyes darted around the library, and then to the injured woman on the ground. He had to act fast. Without thinking, Jack grabbed her gently, pulling her behind the nearest bookshelf. He had no plan, no strategy, just pure instinct. He dragged her across the floor, praying the soldiers wouldn't see them. The bookshelves seemed to loom above him like silent giants, their dark shadows hiding him for the moment. He could hear the soldiers' footsteps moving closer, and his breath came in short, panicked bursts. Then, with one final push, he pulled the alien woman into a small storage room at the back. He could hear the soldiers in the distance, searching. Jack didn't dare breathe too loudly, his eyes wide as he peered through the crack in the door. They were close, He could see their shadowed figures through the small window on the door. He had hidden them just in time. But the question gnawed at him: who was she? And why had the soldiers been after her? Jack didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. He had to help her. For a moment, everything was still. The sound of the soldiers faded, replaced by the soft hiss of her breathing. Jack crouched next to her. She had come to, her eyes fluttering open, blinking in confusion. Her gaze locked onto his. For a second, it seemed like she didn't recognize him. Then she muttered something, her voice weak but urgent. "Help. Me." Jack didn't understand the words, but the plea in her voice was clear. His mind raced. He didn't know who she was or what she had done, but he knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just any alien. There was something about her, something beyond her strange appearance, that made him want to protect her. As if fate had thrown them together in the most unlikely way. The alien woman reached for his arm, her fingers trembling. "They will come for me," she whispered, her words barely audible, but Jack understood the weight behind them. The soldiers would come, but Jack couldn't turn his back on her now. He would figure out the answers later. For now, he just needed to keep her safe. And so, in the middle of a night that had started like any other, Jack's world would change forever. The quiet of the library was broken only by the faint sound of heavy footsteps. Jack's pulse raced as he kept his hand over the alien woman's mouth, trying to keep her silent as they huddled together in the small storage room. His heart thudded in his chest, and every passing moment felt like an eternity. He could feel her body tense in his arms, her alien eyes wide with fear. She was still trembling, her breath shallow as she clung to him. But Jack couldn't blame her. He felt just as scared. Outside, the soldiers were methodically searching the library, their voices cold and detached. "Nothing here. Move to the next room," one of them commanded. Their robotic precision made it clear that they were no ordinary soldiers. They were part of a highly trained force, and they were not going to stop until they found their target. Jack squeezed his eyes shut, his mind racing. How had this happened? One moment, he was a regular librarian in a quiet corner of the city, and now he was hiding an alien in his arms, while a squad of soldiers combed the building looking for her. He had never imagined his life would take such a turn, but it was happening, and there was no going back. The alien woman shifted slightly in his arms, making a soft noise. Jack quickly pressed his finger to her lips, silently urging her to stay still. The soldiers' voices grew louder as they drew closer to the room, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't find them. "You're not getting away this time." A soldier's voice rang out from the hallway, closer than before. They were only a few doors away. Jack's thoughts raced. He had to get her out of here. There was no way the soldiers would just leave without finding her. And if they did, they wouldn't stop until they had her back. He couldn't let that happen. But how could he escape with her? He wasn't trained for this. He wasn't some military hero, just a librarian who liked reading books about things that never seemed to happen in real life. He glanced at the woman, her alien features now more visible in the dim light. Her skin, a shimmering shade of violet, seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Her eyes, full of fear and desperation, locked with his. There was a silent understanding between them. She wasn't just an alien. She was a person who needed help. And Jack was the only one who could give it. His mind was spinning, but then he had an idea. The back exit. He had never really used it, but he knew it was there, hidden behind a row of old filing cabinets. If he could get her to that exit, they might stand a chance of escaping the soldiers. It was a long shot, but it was the only one he had. The footsteps grew louder. The soldiers were almost at the door. Jack had no time to waste. "Stay close," Jack whispered urgently, carefully lifting the alien woman into his arms. She was light, but her body tensed at his touch, and he could feel her heart pounding. They moved slowly, carefully, toward the back of the storage room. Every creak of the floor felt like an alarm. They were seconds away from being discovered. As Jack reached for the filing cabinet, ready to slide it aside, a loud bang came from the hallway. One of the soldiers had kicked a door open. "Nothing here. She must have gone out the back," a voice shouted. Jack's breath caught in his throat. They had just been seconds away from being caught. He forced himself to move faster, sliding the cabinet aside with more force than he thought possible. The door to the back exit was just ahead, and all he needed to do was get there without making a sound. The woman's eyes flickered toward the door, and Jack could see the glimmer of hope in them. She could feel it too. They were so close. But then, just as Jack was about to push the door open, he heard a low hum, like the sound of something charging up. He turned just in time to see a figure step into the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light. A soldier. His face was hidden behind a helmet, but the glowing red light from his weapon made it clear that he was armed and ready to fire. "Stop right there," the soldier barked. His voice was a sharp command, and Jack froze. For a moment, there was silence, an electric tension in the air. Jack could feel the alien woman stiffen in his arms. She knew they were trapped. But Jack didn't have time to think. Without hesitating, he shoved the door open and bolted. The sudden movement caught the soldier off guard, but not enough to stop him. Jack heard the sharp whine of a laser gun charging, and then a flash of light. The blast missed them by inches, but Jack didn't slow down. He could hear the soldier calling for reinforcements, but he didn't care. His only focus was the alien woman in his arms. They had to get out of the building. They had to survive. They sprinted down the darkened hallway, Jack's legs burning from the effort. The woman clung to him, her body trembling, but she didn't make a sound. Jack could feel the weight of the soldiers closing in, their voices shouting from behind him. He had to push faster, had to move quicker. The back door was in sight, but there was no time to waste. With one final surge of energy, Jack reached the door and threw it open, slamming it behind them just as a burst of laser fire singed the air where they had just been. They were outside now, but the chase had only just begun. "Keep moving," Jack hissed, pulling the woman with him as they dashed into the dark alleyway. There was no time to look back. They couldn't stop. Behind them, the soldiers regrouped, their voices louder now as they spread out in search of the two fugitives. Jack knew they wouldn't stop until they had her, but he couldn't let that happen. Not after everything they had been through. He would protect her. The night was their only cover now. And Jack would fight with everything he had to keep her safe. The night was dark, with the faint hum of distant city lights casting long shadows over the alleyway. Jack's chest was heaving, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he pulled the alien woman along, her hand clutching his tightly. They had escaped the soldiers, but Jack knew they couldn't stop running. The sound of boots hitting the pavement in the distance told him they were being pursued, and their only chance of survival was to stay ahead. The alley seemed endless as they sprinted through it, the cool night air mixing with the adrenaline rushing through his veins. The woman, whose violet skin seemed to shimmer even in the low light, was struggling to keep up. She was unaccustomed to the fast pace, and Jack could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Despite her alien strength, she wasn't used to the kind of desperate, life-or-death escape they were in. "Stay with me," Jack urged, looking over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed too closely. His heart pounded as he glanced around the dark alley, trying to think of their next move. He could feel her grip tightening, and for a brief moment, he wondered if she trusted him. She had to. They were in this together, whether she liked it or not. Jack knew he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained to fight, or to survive in a world where dangerous aliens were always lurking just around the corner. But what he had was determination, and that was all he needed right now. "We need to find shelter, somewhere they can't find us," Jack said as he pulled her into a small, hidden doorway between two rundown buildings. It was a grimy space, but it was better than the wide-open streets where they were exposed. The woman's alien eyes flicked nervously as she glanced out toward the alley, her sharp hearing no doubt picking up the faintest noises. Jack could tell she was on edge, every instinct telling her to flee, to hide. But there was no escaping their situation now. They had no choice but to stick together if they wanted to survive. "They'll be looking for us," she whispered, her voice soft yet filled with a quiet urgency. "I'm not what they think I am, but they'll never stop searching for me." Jack nodded. "We'll deal with that when we can. But right now, we need to make sure we don't get caught." He looked down at her, trying to gauge her expression. He could see fear, yes, but there was something more, something deeper, a glimmer of trust, or maybe even a hint of something like respect. Jack couldn't be sure, but it was enough to make him feel like they could still make it out of this. The woman's violet skin shimmered faintly in the dim light as she straightened up, her posture improving. Jack had been wrong to think she was helpless. She was far from it. He had seen the strength in her when she fought to escape the soldiers earlier, and there was a fire in her that was undeniable. She wasn't just any alien. She was different. She wasn't just running. She was calculating, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jack could feel the tension between them, the unspoken bond that had formed in the last few hours. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They were becoming partners in a way. And that meant he needed to trust her just as much as she had to trust him. "Who are you?" Jack asked, lowering his voice slightly. "I mean, why are they after you?" The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face as if deciding how much to reveal. She seemed like she was weighing the choice carefully, the alien pride in her eyes mixed with the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide. "My name is Erin," she said softly, finally answering. "I am from a place far away, from a world where our kind is ruled by those who have no mercy. I was born into a life where I was trained to fight, to serve a higher purpose. But I rejected it." She paused, her voice quivering for the first time. "Now they hunt me, because I am not what they want me to be." Jack could see the pain in her eyes, and it struck him harder than he expected. She wasn't just running from soldiers. She was running from everything she had ever known. From her past, from her own people. The life she had been born into was one of power and control, and now she was outcast, hunted for the very thing that made her different. "They won't stop, Jack," Erin said, her voice fierce again. "They'll come after us until we're dead. But I won't go back. I refuse to." Jack nodded slowly, understanding her better now. He knew what it was like to feel trapped by circumstances, to be forced into a life that didn't fit. He had seen it before, in his own world, in people who had nowhere to turn. But he wasn't going to let her be hunted down. Not on his watch. "You're not going back," Jack promised, his voice firm. "And neither am I. We'll figure this out together. We've got this." The determination in his voice seemed to spark something in her. Erin's alien features softened, and for the first time, Jack saw a faint, almost imperceptible smile tug at the corner of her lips. It was small, but it was there, and Jack couldn't help but feel like it was the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. As Jack reached for the filing cabinet, ready to slide it aside, a loud bang came from a hallway. One of the soldiers had kicked a door open. "Nothing here." "She must have gone out the back," a voice shouted. Jack's breath caught in his throat. They had just been seconds away from being caught. He forced himself to move faster, sliding the cabinet aside with more force than he thought possible. The door to the back exit was just ahead, and all he needed to do was get there without making a sound. The woman's eyes flickered toward the door, and Jack could see the glimmer of hope in them. She could feel it too. They were so close. But then, just as Jack was about to push the door open, he heard a low hum, like the sound of something charging up. He turned just in time to see a figure step into the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light. A soldier. His face was hidden behind a helmet, but the glowing red light from his weapon made it clear that he was armed and ready to fire. "Stop right there," the soldier barked. His voice was a sharp command, and Jack froze. For a moment, there was silence, an electric tension in the air. Jack could feel the alien woman stiffen in his arms. She knew they were trapped. But Jack didn't have time to think. Without hesitating, he shoved the door open and bolted. The sudden movement caught the soldier off guard, but not enough to stop him. Jack heard the sharp whine of a laser gun charging, and then a flash of light. The blast missed them by inches, but Jack didn't slow down. He could hear the soldier calling for reinforcements, but he didn't care. His only focus was the alien woman in his arms. They had to get out of the building. They had to survive. They sprinted down the darkened hallway, Jack's legs burning from the effort. The woman clung to him, her body trembling, but she didn't make a sound. Jack could feel the weight of the soldiers closing in, their voices shouting from behind him. He had to push faster, had to move quicker. The back door was in sight, but there was no time to waste. With one final surge of energy, Jack reached the door and threw it open, slamming it behind them just as a burst of laser fire singed the air where they had just been. They were outside now, but the chase had only just begun. "Keep moving," Jack hissed, pulling the woman with him as they dashed into the dark alleyway. There was no time to look back. They couldn't stop. Behind them, the soldiers regrouped, their voices louder now as they spread out in search of the two fugitives. Jack knew they wouldn't stop until they had her. But he couldn't let that happen. Not after everything they had been through. He would protect her. The night was their only cover now, and Jack would fight with everything he had to keep her safe. The night was dark, with a faint hum of distant city lights casting long shadows over the alleyway. Jack's chest was heaving, his breath coming in sharp gasps, as he pulled the alien woman along, her hand clutching his tightly. They had escaped the soldiers, but Jack knew they couldn't stop running. The sound of boots hitting the pavement in the distance told him they were being pursued, and their only chance of survival was to stay ahead. The alley seemed endless as they sprinted through it, the cool night air mixing with the adrenaline rushing through his veins. The woman, whose violet skin seemed to shimmer even in the low light, was struggling to keep up. She was unaccustomed to the fast pace, and Jack could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Despite her alien strength, she wasn't used to the kind of desperate, life-or-death escape they were in. "Stay with me," Jack urged, looking over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed too closely. His heart pounded as he glanced around the dark alley, trying to think of their next move. He could feel her grip tightening, and for a brief moment, he wondered if she trusted him. She had to. They were in this together, whether she liked it or not. They both knew their survival depended on one thing: their ability to trust each other. They were an unlikely pair, thrown together by fate, but together they had a chance to fight back, to survive, and to make a stand against the forces that would stop at nothing to break them. As they settled in the small, dark room, Jack's mind was racing with the possibilities. The soldiers wouldn't stop searching, but Jack knew they had time. They weren't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, together they could make the world see just how dangerous an unlikely partnership could be. Erin turned to him, her eyes steady and focused. "We fight together," she said. "And when this is over, I'll make sure they know who I really am." Jack gave a small nod. "We'll make sure of it." The air was thick with tension as Jack and Erin crouched in the shadows, waiting. The only sound that could be heard was the distant hum of the city and the occasional shuffle of footsteps echoing from the alley. Jack's pulse was racing, his fingers tightly gripping the hilt of the makeshift weapon he had cobbled together. He wasn't a soldier, but in that moment, he felt like he had no choice but to fight. He had to protect her. Erin stood beside him, her alien eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced precision. She had grown accustomed to the chaos of their world, to the danger that followed her every step. Her once fearful expression had hardened, and now she was no longer the terrified fugitive. She had become a warrior in her own right, one who would fight for her freedom, no matter the cost. The battle was about to begin. "We need to move fast," Jack whispered, keeping his voice low, but with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. He had learned quickly that hesitation was a luxury they couldn't afford. The soldiers were closing in, and they had no time to waste. They had been hunted long enough, and Jack knew that if they didn't act now, they would be cornered. Erin gave him a nod, her lips curling into a determined smile. "I'll create a distraction," she said, her voice calm, even in the face of imminent danger. "Just be careful," Jack replied, his voice betraying a hint of concern. "You're not alone in this anymore." She shot him a glance, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, but in the short time they had been together, she had learned to trust Jack more than she ever thought possible. She knew, deep down, that they were a team now, one that would stand together no matter what came next. The first of the soldiers came into view, their heavy boots clanging against the metal floor as they patrolled the alley. They were searching, looking for any sign of movement, any hint that their prey was nearby. Erin's body tensed, her alien muscles coiling like a spring ready to snap. She was faster than any human, more agile than Jack could ever hope to be. But Jack wasn't going to let her do this alone. "Now," Jack ordered, his heart pounding in his chest. Without hesitation, Erin sprang into action, her feet barely making a sound as she moved like a shadow through the alley. In a split second, she had disappeared, leaving Jack to wonder how she could move so silently, so efficiently. The soldiers were still unaware of her presence. They moved closer, and Jack knew it was only a matter of time before they would discover their hideout. He couldn't afford to let them get too close. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. It was time to make his move. He rushed toward the nearest soldier, his body low to the ground. With a quick motion, he slammed his makeshift weapon into the soldier's back, knocking him off balance. The soldier crumpled to the ground with a grunt, but before Jack could react, "Two more, but we need to keep moving. We can't stay here." Jack didn't need any more encouragement. He nodded, his resolve hardening. They couldn't afford to linger. Every moment they spent in this alley made them more vulnerable to the growing number of soldiers coming after them. With Erin leading the way, they sprinted down the alley, their footsteps echoing through the narrow streets. The soldiers were still on their tail, but Jack was starting to feel like they were gaining ground. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for Erin, for the strange connection they had forged in such a short time. Erin turned to him with a determined look on her face. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "We need to make them regret ever coming after us." Jack grinned, his eyes blazing with newfound purpose. "I couldn't agree more." The chase continued through the night, the sounds of battle echoing in the streets as they pushed forward. Jack and Erin fought side by side, their movements growing more synchronized with every step. They had become more than just unlikely allies. They were a team, and together they were unstoppable. As the final soldier fell to the ground, Jack and Erin paused for a moment, both of them breathing heavily, sweat dripping from their faces. The battle was far from over, but they had won this round. Erin glanced at him, a rare smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Not bad for a human." Jack laughed, a sound of triumph. "I could say the same about you." They didn't have time to celebrate, though. They knew more soldiers were on the way. The battle had only just begun, and there was no turning back. But one thing was certain: they weren't going to stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. And together, they would make sure that those who hunted them would never forget the price of underestimating the strength of a human and an alien warrior united. The night air felt thick with tension, the city lights flickering in the distance like stars watching over them. Jack and Erin had been on the run for days now, but something had changed. There was a heaviness in the air that neither of them could ignore, something darker than the usual danger that followed them. Jack could sense it. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure they were ready for it. Erin, ever the tactician, seemed more focused than usual. Her sharp eyes darted around their makeshift hideout, scanning the perimeter with a level of intensity that almost made Jack nervous. He'd seen her take down soldiers, evade entire squads, but now her usual confidence was tinged with uncertainty. "What's wrong?" Jack asked, his voice low as he approached her. Erin looked at him, her violet eyes betraying the weight of the emotions she usually kept hidden. "There's a traitor among us," she said, her voice steady, but Jack could hear the undertone of concern. "I don't know who, but we've been compromised." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. They had made allies, people who helped them when the odds seemed impossible. But if someone in their ranks was working against them, well, that would change everything. "How do you know?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the anxiety creeping in. "I can feel it," Erin replied. "The way the soldiers always seem to be one step ahead. They've been tracking our movements too precisely, too quickly. It's not just luck. Someone is feeding them information." Jack's mind raced. They couldn't afford to trust anyone if there was even the smallest chance of betrayal. The thought of it made his stomach churn. They had fought so hard to get this far, to escape the clutches of their enemies. And now it seemed like they were about to lose everything because of one person's betrayal. They needed to act fast. "Who could it be?" Jack muttered, the words barely escaping his lips. "I don't know," Erin said, her voice tinged with regret. "But it's not just about who. It's about how we stop it before it destroys us." As if on cue, the soft hum of distant engines reached their ears. Jack's heart sank as he realized what it meant. The enemy was getting closer. He turned to Erin, his jaw set with determination. "We need to find the traitor, now," he said, his voice resolute. Erin nodded, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, a deep sadness that Jack couldn't quite place. "We don't have much time, but we will find them." The two of them spent hours combing through their hideout, questioning anyone they had come into contact with over the past few days. But every lead came up empty. No one seemed suspicious. No one acted out of the ordinary. It was as if the traitor was hiding in plain sight, watching them with a careful eye. Jack's frustration was growing, his patience wearing thin. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Every minute they spent searching was another minute the soldiers were closing in on them. Finally, it was Erin who made the connection. "Jack, I think I know who it is." He turned to her, his pulse quickening. "Who?" "The one who offered us shelter when we first arrived," Erin said quietly. "The one who seemed too eager to help." Jack's heart sank as the realization hit him. The one person they had trusted without question. The one who had promised them safety and shelter. The one who had given them hope when they had none left. He had been the traitor all along. "How could we have missed it?" Jack muttered, his voice full of regret. "It wasn't your fault," Erin said, her voice sharp. "We were desperate. We needed to trust someone. But now it didn't matter. The traitor had to be stopped. They couldn't afford to let him get away." Jack and Erin made their way to the safe house where they had been hiding, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had to do. The traitor was already there, waiting for them, a smug look on his face as he saw them approach. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually," the traitor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But it's too late now." Before Jack could react, the sound of gunfire echoed through the alleyway, followed by the sharp crack of a distant explosion. Soldiers, hundreds of them, were closing in from all sides. The trap had been set, and they had walked right into it. Jack's mind raced. There was no way they could fight their way out of this. They were outnumbered, surrounded on all sides. And the traitor, he was the one who had led them into this mess. But then, in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. Erin stepped forward, her eyes fierce with resolve. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was something else, a force of nature, unstoppable and powerful. She threw herself into the fray, taking on the soldiers with a speed and ferocity that left Jack in awe. She was unstoppable, moving faster than any human could keep up with, knocking down enemy after enemy without breaking a sweat. But Jack knew that this wouldn't last forever. There were too many soldiers, too many traps, and they had no way of escaping. As the battle raged around them, Jack made a decision. He couldn't let Erin do this alone. He couldn't let her sacrifice everything for him. With a final, desperate move, Jack lunged toward the traitor, knocking him to the ground. He didn't care about the fight anymore. He had to stop the betrayal, no matter what it took. But as he looked down at the traitor, something caught his eye. The traitor had a detonator in his hand. He was going to blow them all to hell. Without thinking, Jack grabbed the detonator, his finger hovering over the button. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. The world was closing in around them, but this was their last chance. With a single press of the button, the explosion rang out, deafening and final. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the final battle loomed over them. Jack and Erin stood on the edge of their makeshift stronghold, staring out at the vast expanse of the battlefield. The once quiet city was now a war zone, and it was all about to come to a head. The countdown was ticking down, and they had no time left. The explosion from earlier had thrown the enemy into disarray, but it had also drawn them all into one place. The traitor had triggered a series of alarms, calling in reinforcements from every corner of the city. Jack and Erin had no illusions now. They were fighting for their lives. If they didn't act fast, they would lose everything they had fought for. "Are you ready?" Jack asked, looking at Erin, who was already preparing for the final showdown. Erin didn't answer right away. She was focusing on her weapons, checking the ammo, adjusting her gear. Her calm demeanor hid the storm inside her. Jack could see it in her eyes. She was ready, but the weight of the situation was heavy on her shoulders. "Ready," she said finally, her voice a mix of resolve and pain. They both knew this was the last fight. There would be no running this time. No more hiding. They had to stand and face the enemy head-on. As the first wave of enemy soldiers arrived, Jack and Erin took their positions. They were not alone. The allies they had gathered over the past few days had rallied to their side, and though they were outnumbered, there was a fire in them that could not be extinguished. They had come this far, and they were going to make it count. The sound of boots pounding against the ground, the crackling of comms, the roar of distant explosions. It was a symphony of chaos. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but there was no fear, only the determination to see this through. They had come too far to fail now. The first wave hit them hard, soldiers clad in advanced armor charging forward with relentless force. Jack was at the front, his pulse rifle in hand, taking down enemy after enemy with precision. He had fought in wars before, but this felt different. This was personal. This was for survival, for the future of humanity. Erin was a blur of motion beside him, her alien strength and agility allowing her to cut through their enemies with ease. She moved like a shadow, faster than any human could follow, but Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for redemption, for the chance to prove that she was more than the mockery others had made her out to be. They fought side by side, their movements synchronized in a deadly dance of destruction. But the enemies kept coming. Wave after wave, the soldiers pressed in, determined to crush them once and for all. "Jack," Erin shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. "We need to fall back. This is too much for us." Jack shook his head, refusing to give up. "We can't. We finish this here. We have to stop them now, or it's over for all of us." Erin hesitated, then nodded, her resolve hardening once again. They couldn't run. Not now. Not after everything they had sacrificed. Just as they prepared to face the next wave, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath them rumbled again, louder this time. Jack barely had time to react before a massive explosion sent a shockwave through the air, knocking them both off their feet. The blast was deafening, and for a moment, everything went silent. When Jack opened his eyes, everything around him was a blur of smoke and debris. Erin was still lying on the ground beside him, but she was already moving, pushing herself up with the determination Jack had come to expect from her. "We have to keep going," she said, wiping the dust from her face, her eyes fierce. "They're coming." Jack nodded, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do. This was it. This was the final stand. As they moved to regroup with their remaining allies, Jack's thoughts flashed back to the traitor, the man who had led them into this mess. Jack had always trusted people too easily, but this time, he wouldn't make that mistake again. There was no room for weakness now. "Stay focused," Jack said to Erin as they joined the last few fighters who hadn't been taken down. The soldiers from their side were battered and bruised, but they were still standing. They were still fighting, and that was all that mattered. With a signal from Jack, the final charge began. They sprinted forward, pushing through the remaining enemy lines with everything they had left. Every shot that was fired, every grenade that went off, brought them one step closer to victory. But Jack knew they couldn't hold out much longer. They were outnumbered, and their resources were running low. And then, from the chaos, the enemy's commander appeared. He was a massive figure, clad in dark, imposing armor, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. Jack knew that this man, the leader of the opposition, was their final obstacle. If they didn't defeat him, the battle would be lost. "Erin," Jack shouted as he spotted the commander. "We take him down now." Erin didn't need any further encouragement. She charged forward, her weapon raised, but the commander was too fast. With a swing of his arm, he knocked her back, sending her crashing into a nearby wall. "Erin," Jack screamed, rushing to her side. But before he could reach her, the commander's soldiers descended upon him, blocking his path. "You're weak," the commander's voice boomed, his voice deep and cold. "You cannot win. You are nothing but ants beneath my feet." Jack's blood boiled with anger. He was tired of hearing these taunts, tired of the endless struggle. But he wasn't going to let this man destroy everything they had worked for. With a roar, Jack pushed forward, fighting his way through the soldiers, his body aching with exhaustion. Finally, he reached the commander. In a desperate move, he threw himself at the enemy leader, landing a powerful blow to the side of his helmet. The commander staggered, giving Jack just enough time to pull out his last grenade. With everything he had, Jack threw the grenade at the commander. The explosion rang out, sending debris flying in all directions. The battlefield fell silent for a moment as the dust settled. When the smoke cleared, the commander was no more. The battle was over. Jack and Erin stood amidst the wreckage, their bodies battered and bruised, but alive. They had done it. They had fought, and they had won. And as they looked around, they saw the faces of their allies, tired but triumphant. They had faced impossible odds, and they had come out victorious. This was their final stand, and they had won.